Day 2. War and conflict has its own dynamics, and once you give some slack on the leash of the dogs of war, there's great risk that they might just slip out of your hand. On October 17, 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy loosened the slack on his dogs of war, just like his opponent Khrushchev had already done 5 months earlier. I'm Indy Neidell. This is TimeGhost with the second day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the U.S. administration found out that the USSR had placed nuclear missiles on Cuba, they struggled to come up with an immediate response. XCOM, the group dealing with the crisis, wavered between a stern warning to the Soviets to the full-out destruction of Cuba. President Kennedy is undecided and still wants all options to be left on the table. In the morning of October 17th, he receives a briefing outlining the possible courses of action. His close advisor and speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, has compiled the views from the days before. He outlines 4 options. Track A, political warning, and if the missiles are not then removed, limited airstrikes. Track B, limited airstrikes, and then a demand to remove the missiles. Track C, political actions followed by total naval blockade and a declaration of war on Cuba. Track D, full-scale invasion to take Cuba away from Castro with no warning whatsoever. Sorensen points out, it is generally agreed that these missiles, even when fully operational, do not significantly alter the balance of power, i.e., they do not significantly increase the potential megatonnage capable of being unleashed on American soil, even after a surprise American nuclear strike. So, they all agreed that the missiles were not a real problem, and yet the preparations for war went ahead. In fact, a possible invasion of Cuba had long been in planning. The day before the crisis started, an exercise on the Puerto Rican island of Vieques had begun. This exercise was to land on Vieques, which represented a fantasy island nation ruled by the dictator Ortsac, take out Ortsac, and occupy the island. Now, Ortsac is Castro spelled backwards. There was little doubt, even to the slowest minds amongst those involved, what the true objective was. The exercise involves 40 ships, 20,000 Marines, and massive air support, all on its way to Puerto Rico. Diverting them to actually invade Cuba in reality would be possible. With additional preparations and forces, an invasion could be underway in as little as 10 days from today. These additional preparations now begin. All along the eastern seaboard, troops at all bases are discreetly increased and made combat ready. Spy plane activities are also increased, and the plans for the Ortsac exercise revised to fit the new situation. At 8:30 a.m., the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the members of XCOM meet at the Pentagon to continue the decision regarding a definite plan. Defense Secretary McNamara has even spent the night at the Pentagon to supervise planning. From the record, it's obvious that it's not a response to the possible objectives of the Soviets that's driving their decisions, but what the different factions already believed in before the crisis. Those that believed in thawing relations with the Soviets are advocating diplomacy. Those, including the military leaders who have long believed that Cuba must be neutralized, tend towards invasion. The idea of a naval blockade, for which there is neither a plan nor a risk assessment, starts gaining some traction with, among others, General Taylor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. After the meeting, one of the strongest proponents of an invasion, CIA Director McCone, goes to brief President Kennedy at the White House. His notes show that he walks away with the impression that Kennedy too wants to invade, but Kennedy's notes contradict this. He's still very much undecided. McCone then takes a car to Pennsylvania to meet with former President and General Dwight Eisenhower at JFK's request and get his joint presidential and military advice. McCone comes away with the opinion that Eisenhower also supports decisive military action. And yet, no one knows what the Russians are really after, which Sorensen also points out. The Soviet purpose in making this move is not understood, whether it is for purposes of diversion, harassment, provocation, or bargaining. One of the assumptions is that Russia's true objective might be Berlin. The situation in the divided city is also the first topic on the president's regular agenda when he receives the German foreign minister, Dr. Gerhard Schroeder, at 11 a.m. in the White House for a meeting. Kennedy inquires if the Germans have any reason to believe the Soviets would make a renewed move for Berlin.
Wir neigen eher zu der Meinung, dass die Sowjets bei allen Versuchen, vor allen Dingen psychologischen Druck auszuüben, im Grunde darauf aus sind, weiter zu sprechen und weiter zu versuchen, ihre Ziele ohne Gewalt zu erreichen.
Schroeder explains that they don't have any indication of an escalation there, nor does their analysis of the situation show that it would make sense for the Soviets to do so at this point. One thing Schroeder says in passing, though, is remarkably important to the situation.
Ich bin der Überzeugung, dass Khrushchev seinerseits überzeugt ist, dass es gewisse Dinge gibt, für die die Amerikaner und für die der Westen wirklich kämpfen würde. Er muss nur die Partie so spielen, dass man sozusagen weiter und weiter eingeengt ist, ohne reagiert zu haben. Und dann hat er natürlich in dieser psychologischen Auseinandersetzung einen großen Erfolg errungen. Es genügt nach meiner Meinung also nicht, dass die Sowjets wissen, unter bestimmten Umständen wird man kämpfen. Das wissen sie und das glauben sie auch. Sie glauben sogar, dass man einen nuklearen Krieg wegen Berlin riskieren wird, obwohl ihnen den Sowjets das ziemlich verrückt erscheint. Aber sie glauben das.
Of course, Schroeder doesn't know the significance of his words at this point, as he doesn't know about the growing crisis over Cuba. As the day proceeds, this crisis deepens as more intelligence on the missile buildup comes to light. Results of the ultra-high altitude flights over Cuba continue coming in. The Lockheed U-2, nicknamed Dragon Lady, has already played a central part in the crisis and will continue to do so for the duration. This aircraft is a remarkable feat of engineering, but it's also a little bit crazy, okay? In 1962, it's been in operation for just over 7 years. Improved versions are still in use by the U.S. Air Force now in 2017, as it's the fastest way to get aerial reconnaissance at any given point independent of satellite orbits. Now, in 1962, there were very few satellites anyhow, and it's the only way to gather photographic intelligence over enemy territory at a reasonably safe distance from anti-aircraft missiles. Now, reasonably safe is not the same thing as safe, right? Originally, it had been assumed by the United States and Great Britain that Russian radar could only pick up signals up to 19,800 meters, that's like 65,000 feet, because that was as high as British and US radar could go. It was also assumed that Soviet surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, could not reach any higher. Both assumptions were wrong. And back on May 1st, 1960, the Soviets used SAMs to shoot down a U-2 over Russia. The pilot, Captain Francis Gary Powers, parachutes out and survives the crash, while the pilot of a pursuing Soviet MiG-19 isn't so lucky when he is hit by friendly fire and killed. Powers is then captured by the Russians, and the whole thing becomes a complicated diplomatic incident, which only ends this year, in February 1962, when Powers and another U.S. spy are exchanged for 2 Russian operatives held by the U.S. But the U-2 isn't only dangerous to fly because it can be shot down. In essence, the plane is a combination of a subsonic jet and a glider, right? At ultra-high altitude, it has to be flown within a narrow speed corridor to avoid stalling. The pilot can only vary speed by 5 miles per hour up or down to keep the plane flying and not have it fall apart around him. At normal altitudes, the controls are extremely resistant, requiring the pilot to use raw muscle strength to maneuver. With its short fuselage and enormously long wings, it has an operating altitude of 70,000 feet. That's over 21,000 meters. But to be light enough to reach that altitude, many compromises in safety design had to be made. The cabin is only partially pressurized, and the pilots have to wear spacesuits and breathe pure oxygen to stay alive. There have been several incidents of decompression sickness and at least 9 cases of pilots suffering permanent brain damage. Moreover, at least one pilot has passed out, crashed, and died because of malfunction in the oxygen supply. Landing the plane is extremely tricky, as the long wing to fuselage ratio creates ground effects that may cause sudden upsurges and a crash. When you put the plane down, the wingtips are pulled into the ground, which is why they're coated with titanium to withstand the friction. Landing is so complicated that it requires a chase car to guide the pilot and a second pilot on the ground assisting the flying pilot by relaying how the plane is behaving from an outside view.
3 feet, tail still up at 3 feet. There's 2.
1.5, 1 foot, holding it 1 foot.
Down to 6 inches. Nice.
Pump system, we got a couple of vehicles on the runway, south to north, south point bench.
Because of past incidents and the obvious fact that it's illegal to fly planes into other countries' airspace without permission, the U-2 program is highly controversial. In 1962, it isn't even operated by the military. The U-2s belong to the CIA and have been financed without congressional budget approval through secret slush funds, which the CIA is the only federal agency that is allowed to have. At this point, they prove invaluable to assess the situation over Cuba. Mid-October saw mostly clear weather over the island. The U-2 flight photos are now yielding new information. The analysts discover a range of surface-to-air missile batteries that could threaten the U-2s and which definitely lower the success probability of airstrikes. They discover more mid-range missile sites, but the pictures are not high resolution enough to discern if the SS-4 missiles are launch-ready, nor where the warheads might be stored. Most alarming is the discovery of intermediate-range missile launch ramps. Although they don't find any missiles for these, this now extends the threat beyond the American East Coast and Midwest. These missiles could reach any major city in the continental U.S. except Seattle in the distant Pacific Northwest. While Kennedy flies out to do political rallies in Connecticut, members of XCOM meet again. The new information doesn't help the decision-making, but it does harden the drive for a decisive military response. Amongst this saber-rattling, one voice reaches Kennedy urging restraint. It's Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. The former Democratic presidential candidate is famous for his intellect, reason, eloquence, and diplomacy. The hardliners consider him too soft and indecisive. During the Bay of Pigs invasion, he had largely been kept out of the loop to avoid his uncomfortable advice. And with incomplete information at his hands, he then suffered public humiliation when he firmly denied any operative involvement by the U.S. in an open session at the UN, only to be refuted by his own administration. This time around, he's in the loop and receives the XCOM briefings. He now urges the president to talk to Khrushchev and Castro to avoid a conflict that will inevitably lead to retaliation in other regions. He writes, "To start or risk starting a nuclear war is bound to be divisive at best, and the judgments of history seldom coincide with the tempers of the moment." He ends his letter with, "I confess I have many misgivings about the proposed course of action, but to discuss them further would add little to what you already have in mind. So I will only repeat that it should be clear as a pikestaff that the U.S. was, is, and will be ready to negotiate the elimination of bases and anything else. Blackmail and intimidation never, negotiation and sanity always." These wise words will not be heeded for many days to come. And on this October 17th, as night settles over America and a new day dawns in the Soviet Union, the preparations for war on both sides continue and begin taking on a life of their own. See you on day 3, when President Kennedy confronts the Soviets for the first time and gets the response he feared. If you're just joining our show, you can find the first episode of our 2 preludes to the crisis right here. Do not forget to subscribe to never miss an episode, and please support us with a donation on Patreon so that we can make even more awesome history. Good night and good luck.